She entered the world with a heartbeat already struggling against time. From her first trembling breaths, Maria Antonietta of Austria-Este carried an invisible weight inside her chest, one that slowed her steps, dimmed her days, and quietly shaped every corner of her existence. While other princesses learned to dance, to charm, to prepare for thrones and alliances, she learned instead how to sit still without fainting, how to hide her breathlessness behind a gentle smile, and how to measure her life not in years but in moments of borrowed strength. She watched happiness from afar, always separated by a thin barrier of weakness that she could never break through. And before she reached 25, the heart that had never truly kept pace with the world finally surrendered. This is the story of a Habsburg princess who lived softly, suffered silently, and slipped away before life ever opened its doors to her. Maria Antonietta of Austria-Este entered the world on the 18th of April, 1858, in the quiet halls of Modena, wrapped in the dignity of the Este and Bavarian bloodlines, yet burdened with a fragility no royal heritage could shield her from. She was the youngest child of Francesco V d'Este, the last reigning Duke of Modena, and Adelgunde of Bavaria, a princess known for her gentle discipline and deep Catholic devotion. To her parents, she was a blessing born into an uncertain political era. To the court physicians, she was a newborn whose heart spoke a worrying truth from the very beginning. They observed her shallow breaths, the faint bluish hue that crept across her lips whenever she cried, and the subtle tremor in her chest where the pulse raced too fast, too unevenly, as though her body was fighting a storm no one else could see. From those first hours, doctors suspected a congenital heart defect, one of many quiet inheritances that had begun to emerge among the tightly interwoven dynasties of Europe. No one said it aloud, but every midwife and physician in the palace understood the pattern. The same families marrying across generations, the same noble bloodlines looping back into themselves, creating children of exquisite rank but fragile bodies. Maria Antonietta was one of them. Her parents refused to believe that the small gasps and trembling sighs meant something more than infant weakness. They clung to hope in the way only grieving or fearful parents can. Yet the truth revealed itself with the patience of inevitability. While her older siblings grew strong, energetic, and lively, she remained soft and delicate, her energy draining after even the smallest exertion. In the nursery, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Other children played, squealed, tugged toys across the floor. Maria Antonietta lay quietly wrapped in blankets, her chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven beats that made her nurse instinctively place a hand against her back to steady her breathing. She would brighten for moments, smiling faintly, reaching out for a parent or a sibling only to retreat again into exhaustion, as if her body could offer affection only in borrowed intervals. Servants whispered that the little archduchess seemed carved from porcelain, beautiful in a fragile, otherworldly way, as though she belonged more to the realm of angels than to the world of living children. Her father, Francesco V, watched her closely with the heavy-eyed expression of a man who already carried the weight of a collapsing duchy. Political storms loomed over Modena, stirring shadows across the palace long before unification swept the Este family into exile. Yet even amidst that instability, he felt a private dread when he looked at his youngest daughter. He knew enough of medicine and enough of family history to understand the danger. Royal courts kept such illnesses quiet, shrouding them in euphemisms: delicate constitution, nervous weakness, tendency toward faintness. But no matter what words were used, the truth remained unchanged. The heart of his youngest child was too fragile for the life she had been born into. Adelgunde, her mother, tried to fill the nursery with gentleness. She dismissed loud toys, discouraged rambunctious games, and forbade servants from making sudden noises that could startle the little girl. Every small gasp that escaped Maria Antonietta's lips made Adelgunde's face tighten with worry. She prayed for her daughter every night in the family chapel, lighting candles that flickered like the child's uncertain heartbeat. Her faith offered comfort, but never certainty. She had seen enough illness in royal circles to recognize that some children were not meant to grow old. By the time Maria Antonietta learned to walk, The limitations of her body shaped her entire world. She took short, careful steps, each one measured as if her heart needed permission before allowing her legs to move. She never ran across courtyards. She never leapt into a parent's arms with the unrestrained joy of childhood. Even laughter came gently, in soft breaths that faded quickly, leaving her chest fluttering like a bird struggling inside a cage. When she tried to play with her siblings, she often clung to furniture for support, her face paling after only a few minutes. Her nurse would rush to her side, scoop her up, and carry her back to the quiet nursery where she could rest in the safety of silence. The doctors examined her regularly, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and helplessness. There was nothing they could offer beyond recommendations for rest, protection, and constant observation. 19th century medicine had no tools for repairing a malformed heart, no treatments to strengthen failing valves or calm dangerous arrhythmias. All they could do was watch, record symptoms, and urge the family to accept a reality they wished desperately to deny. Behind closed doors, they admitted she might not reach adulthood. Her heart simply worked too hard for too little result. Even as a child, Maria Antonietta seemed to sense her own limits. She developed a stillness uncommon in someone so young, as if she understood instinctively that sudden excitement or disappointment could send her heart spiraling into painful rhythms. She learned to move softly, speak quietly, and preserve her energy. Her fragility became the unspoken center of the household, shaping schedules, guiding conversations, and dictating the rhythm of her days. Her life began not with promise, but with boundaries. Every choice her family made, every room she entered, every journey she avoided, every celebration she watched from afar was shaped by the delicate organ that beat inside her chest. The world around her moved forward. Her siblings grew healthy and strong. Modena trembled under political uncertainty. Europe shifted with wars and revolutions, but Maria Antonietta remained the still point in a storm she was too fragile to resist. Her story, from the very first moment, was written not in royal ambition or courtly achievement, but in quiet breaths, cautious steps, and the shadow of an illness that never loosened its hold. Maria Antonietta's childhood unfolded not in gardens, corridors, or lively playrooms, but within a carefully curated rectangle of quiet spaces designed to protect a heart that could not withstand even the gentlest strain. In most royal households, children filled the palace with noise, running along polished floors, hiding behind velvet drapes, practicing bows and curtsies, laughing too loudly for the comfort of tutors. But in the cramped world of her fragile lungs and trembling pulse, silence became both shield and prison. Every caretaker who entered her orbit understood that excessive movement, emotional excitement, or even a sudden change in temperature could send her heart into a frantic rhythm. Thus, her childhood was built around caution, woven deliberately to avoid every possible threat. Her daily routine reflected this vigilance. She woke later than her siblings, not because she was lazy, but because her nights were often restless. Weak circulation made her hands cold, and shallow breaths disrupted her sleep. When morning came, her nurse warmed her blankets before she sat up, fearing that abrupt exposure to cool air could tighten her chest. Only after she steadied her breathing did she rise, always slowly, always with assistance. Even dressing her required care, layers of fabric draped gently to avoid pressing against her ribs. While other children were ushered to music or language lessons, Maria Antonietta was led to the quietest corner of the palace, where she could sit without strain. Her nurse carried a small wooden stool everywhere, knowing the young princess would need to rest after only a few steps. Court tutors adapted lessons to her condition. They avoided long sessions, kept their voices soft, and stopped whenever her face paled or her fingers trembled. Her education was shaped not by royal expectations but by the rhythm of her heartbeat. The rooms she inhabited became extensions of herself. The bedroom, always dimly lit, held embroidered cushions and a collection of small devotional images that her mother placed near her bed for comfort. The adjoining sitting room contained little more than a table for needlework and a chair positioned near a window for the rare hours when she had enough strength to sit upright and watch the world outside. The chapel, where she spent many mornings, offered her the peace of ritual slow prayers, the muted glow of candles, and the steady comfort of routine. For most children, 3 rooms would have felt confining. For Maria Antonietta, they became the borders of her entire universe. She rarely ventured beyond them. Running was forbidden, climbing stairs was dangerous, participating in ceremonies was unthinkable. Even joyful events, family gatherings, musical evenings, small celebrations were carefully managed. If she insisted on attending, servants positioned chairs strategically so she could sit at any moment, and her mother hovered nearby, monitoring every hint of strain in her daughter's expression. Often, after only minutes of polite presence, Maria Antonietta would feel dizziness creeping through her limbs, and her nurse would quietly guide her back to the sanctuary of her quiet rooms. Her siblings occupied a different world entirely. They practiced horseback riding in the palace courtyard, studied dance and etiquette, attended feasts, and prepared for the public lives expected of royalty. Maria Antonietta observed these rituals from behind glass windows or cracked doors, her pale fingers sometimes resting against the cool frame as she watched their silhouettes move freely. She loved them, admired them, even envied them, but she also understood that she could not join them. The distance between them was not emotional, but bodily. Their hearts beat strong and steady. Hers stumbled and faltered without warning. A maid who spent years attending her once recalled how carefully the child managed her breath. She described moments when Maria Antonietta laughed softly at a small joke or delighted in a gentle story, only for her amusement to fade quickly into breathlessness. The maid said, "She laughed gently, but her breath never kept up." A simple sentence that captured perfectly the fragile imbalance of the princess's life. Even happiness had limits. Even joy had to be measured and moderated. Because she lived so much of her life indoors, the changing seasons reached her only through filtered sensations. A draft slipping under the door in winter, the scent of distant rain wafting through the open window in spring, the muted echo of carriage wheels on summer stones, the rustle of falling leaves heard from a chair she rarely left. She grew intimately familiar with the patterns of light moving across the walls, the way morning sun drifted from one side of the room to the other, and the way twilight softened everything into a gentle haze. These details became the scenery of her childhood, the quiet choreography of hours she spent preserving her strength. The restrictions placed upon her were meant to protect, yet they also revealed an unspoken truth. Everyone around her knew that her life was unlikely to be long, and they shaped her days to prolong what could not be saved. Her existence demanded vigilance from the adults and patience from the child. She learned early how to sit without fidgeting, how to occupy herself without running, how to accept that the boundaries keeping her safe also kept her isolated. She did not resent her limitations, at least not outwardly. Instead, she developed a gentle acceptance, a stillness that some found angelic, though others sensed it came from resignation rather than serenity. She smiled often, but her smiles were faint and fleeting. She listened intently to stories or conversations, yet rarely participated, conserving her energy as instinctively as birds conserve warmth in winter. She became a child who moved through life like someone half-present, alive, aware, yet always slightly withdrawn, as if her body had taught her from the beginning to approach the world in whispers. By the time she reached adolescence, these patterns were so deeply ingrained that no one questioned them. The palace had grown accustomed to making room for her fragility. Schedules shifted to accommodate her rest. Footsteps softened when passing her chambers. Staff communicated in lowered voices. Her life was one of constant accommodation, constant caution, and constant awareness of a heart that could not keep pace with the life around her. Her childhood, in the end, was not defined by what she experienced, but by everything she never could. It was a youth shaped by absence, the absence of running, laughter, adventure, and freedom. She grew up not in the embrace of a lively world, but in the quiet orbit of rooms designed to restrain the very life she wished she could live. Maria Antonietta was barely a year old when the world beneath her family's feet shifted forever. The Duchy of Modena, ruled by her father, Francesco d'Este, for generations, fell to the sweeping tide of Italian unification. What had once seemed like a stable, inherited realm, an anchor for the Este dynasty, since the Renaissance collapsed under the weight of nationalist movements and political upheaval that reshaped the Italian peninsula. For a fragile child, too young to understand politics or rebellion, the consequences were still profound. She would grow up not in the land of her birth, but in the echoing corridors of exile. The departure from Modena was not a dramatic escape in the dead of night, but it carried the quiet devastation of a family uprooted against its will. Servants moved quietly through the palace corridors, packing belongings without drawing attention to their own grief. Her mother hurried through rooms, checking on her children, ensuring they were dressed warmly and carried gently, whispering assurances that sounded more like prayers than comfort. Francesco V remained stoic, yet his silence was heavier than any lament. He watched the city he once ruled recede through carriage windows, knowing he would never return as its sovereign. And nestled in her nurse's arms, Maria Antonietta breathed softly, unaware that she was leaving behind the only home she would never remember. Her exile began before she had memories to anchor herself to a place. While her siblings recalled the gardens of Modena, the marble corridors of the ducal palace, and the serenity of the surrounding countryside, Maria Antonietta's earliest images of life belonged to borrowed environments, temporary homes, foreign palaces, and rooms filled with the muted sorrow of adults who had lost their world. She grew up listening to nostalgia she could not share. Her parents spoke of Modena in the past tense, their voices carrying the pain of displacement, while she remained an outsider in her own family's memories. The Este household first sought refuge in Austria, surrounded by extended Habsburg relatives who offered protection but not belonging. The Austrian palaces were grand, but grandeur meant little to the young princess whose universe was limited to safe, quiet rooms. Exile amplified that confinement. Instead of the familiarity of Modena, she lived in spaces that never felt entirely hers: guest apartments, borrowed chambers, temporary residences that smelled faintly of lavender and distance. While her body struggled to keep rhythm, her surroundings shifted constantly, denying her the stability that might have softened her fragility. Her father's melancholy permeated the atmosphere. Francesco V was a man trained for rule, raised to continue a dynasty now displaced from its home. The loss of Modena was not merely political, it was the end of the lineage's autonomy. He walked the halls of their new residence in Vienna, or later in Bavaria, with the posture of a man carrying invisible chains. For a child as perceptive as Maria Antonietta, even in her frail state, this sorrow seeped into her understanding of the world. She sensed the heaviness in her father's silence, the urgency in her mother's prayers, the hushed conversations among attendants who feared that the Duke has lost everything. Although she was too young to grasp the details, she absorbed the emotional texture of exile, a dull ache that lingered in every room. Her mother, Adelgunde of Bavaria, turned more deeply toward religion during these years. The family chapel became her sanctuary, and Maria Antonietta often accompanied her there, carried gently because her heart could not handle the walk. The little girl listened to whispered rosaries and murmured supplications for strength, health, and hope. She did not understand the words, but she recognized the trembling devotion in her mother's voice. For her, exile became associated with prayer, candlelight, and the soft scrape of beads passing through fingers. Faith became a backdrop to her childhood, a constant presence in a world otherwise marked by instability. As they moved between Austria and Bavaria, the young princess's health worsened in subtle ways. Travel, even in the gentlest conditions, exhausted her. Changes in climate strained her breathing. New environments, with their unfamiliar acoustics and airflow, sometimes triggered fainting spells. Exile meant adaptation, but her body resisted every shift, while her siblings adjusted to new tutors, new routines, and new surroundings. She struggled to maintain even the fragile equilibrium her heart required. Her nurse learned to read every minute's signal of distress, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her lips paled at the edges, the quiet sigh that indicated she needed rest. Her life became a delicate negotiation between her internal frailty and the external turbulence of a family without a homeland. In this nomadic existence, moments of peace were rare but precious. Sometimes, during quiet evenings in Bavaria, she sat by a window wrapped in soft blankets, watching the distant flicker of village lights. The world seemed wide and unreachable, stretching far beyond what her failing heart permitted. Yet those lights offered a kind of reassurance, a reminder that life continued, even when hers remained confined to rooms and corridors shaped by exile. Perhaps the most profound impact of displacement was psychological rather than physical. Even though she could not consciously recall Modena, she grew up with the knowledge that something had been taken from her family, a duchy, a future, a sense of belonging. Children internalize the emotional climate around them, and Maria Antonietta absorbed her parents' sadness like a sponge. Her father's quiet despair and her mother's anxious religiosity became pillars of her world. She never saw her parents at ease. Their sorrow became her inheritance. By the time she reached early childhood, exile was no longer an event but a condition of her existence. She belonged everywhere and nowhere. Her fragile health kept her from fully engaging with any new environment, and her family's displacement kept them from planting roots. She lived suspended between worlds, the Modena she never knew, the Austria that never quite felt like home, and the Bavaria that offered refuge but not identity. For most children, exile takes the form of longing for a lost homeland. For Maria Antonietta, it was something quieter, a subtle emotional weight, a melancholy stitched into the fabric of her days. It was the backdrop against which she learned to breathe lightly, move slowly, and exist gently in a world that shifted too quickly for her fragile body to follow. Adolescence arrived for Maria Antonietta not as a season of discovery and transformation, but as a slow intensification of everything that had already defined her childhood. While most young women of her rank experienced their teenage years as an ascent toward a public life, attending court functions, learning the art of diplomacy, preparing for advantageous marriages, she entered that stage with the same trembling pulse and breathless fragility that had shaped her earliest days. But now the symptoms deepened. The boundaries around her life, once drawn by caregivers, became enforced by her own failing heart. By the time she turned 13, fainting spells had become frequent, sometimes sudden and without warning. She might be sitting quietly at a table, stitching in silence, when a wave of darkness swept across her vision and her body sagged against the nearest surface. Servants learned to remain within arm's reach, their reflexes sharpened by years of attending to her fragility. Her mother grew more vigilant, watching her daughter's every movement with an anxiety that bordered on dread. Something as simple as rising too quickly from a chair could send Maria Antonietta's pulse spiraling into irregular, skipping beats that left her gasping for breath. Medical examinations became more frequent, though never more hopeful. Each physician arrived with the solemn politeness expected in royal circles, but left with the same helpless verdict. The defect in her heart was worsening. Her chambers filled with the subdued bustle of consultations, stethoscopes placed gently against her ribs, doctors muttering terms like arrhythmia, valvular deficiency, or cardiac weakness in Latin so the little princess would not understand. But she did understand, not in the clinical sense, but in the visceral one. She felt the truth in the heaviness in her chest, in the tightness that seized her lungs after even modest exertion, in the way her pulse sometimes fluttered like a trapped bird trying to break through its cage. This deterioration meant that, unlike other girls her age, her world did not expand. It shrank. Her siblings went on excursions, hunts, music recitals, or diplomatic visits. They learned dances, mastered languages, and began appearing at court with the poise expected of young nobles preparing to fulfill their roles. Meanwhile, Maria Antonietta's days became more repetitive, more confined, more centered on survival rather than development. In the hours when other teenage archduchesses were learning to glide across ballroom floors, she was learning how to breathe through pain, how to lie perfectly still until her pulse steadied, and how to smile faintly so her family would worry less. Her adolescence also brought a painful new awareness. She now understood that her limitations were not temporary childhood constraints, but the permanent architecture of her life. She could no longer frame her condition as something she might outgrow. At 13, she realized she was not merely delayed. She was excluded. Her heart was not something that needed time to strengthen. It was a fragile organ that would never fulfill its purpose fully. This realization struck hardest in social situations. Whenever her sisters prepared for a musical evening or a family celebration, she would watch them from her seat, her face illuminated by the lamplight, her hands resting on folded embroidery. She would smile encouragingly, but inside she felt the ache of absence. She was old enough to understand what she was missing, yet too frail to participate. Meals became miniature ceremonies of caution. Conversations were conducted in gentle tones. Laughter was stifled so as not to overwhelm her. The household adapted to her fragility, but in doing so, it also made her painfully aware of it. Marriage, the destiny of nearly every princess of her era, was never even considered for her. Not officially, not even in whispered discussions. Her heart was too unpredictable, too vulnerable. A royal marriage required stability, physical, emotional, reproductive. The faintest hint of chronic illness could derail alliance plans. For Maria Antonietta, her condition was not a hint, but a defining trait. Her name never appeared in diplomatic rumors. No foreign prince was introduced as a possible suitor. No court lady discreetly took her aside to explain the expectations of royal brides. She watched those rituals unfold around her without being invited to partake. She knew why. Even as a teenager, she had the intelligence and introspection to understand the implications of her illness. She overheard enough conversations, saw enough worried glances exchanged between her parents and physicians, to grasp that her future would not follow the path of her sisters. She once confided to a governess, in a whisper meant only for the walls, "I watch others live while I wait for my heart to stop." It was not despair but recognition and acceptance shaped by years of observing her own limitations. Her emotional life deepened in this period, though it often expressed itself in quiet, internal ways. She became more reflective, more sensitive to beauty and sorrow. She read books not merely as entertainment, but as windows into lives she could not live. Romance novels stirred a yearning in her chest that was almost physical, a mixture of longing and resignation. Devotional writings offered solace, but also a painful reminder of human fragility. Journals became her refuge, a place where she could confess the emotions she dared not speak aloud. Her entries were gentle, introspective, filled with gratitude for small blessings and grief for the growing distance between herself and the world. As the years went on, her frailty became almost ceremonial. Every movement involved deliberation. Every breath required intention. Every attempt at joy was filtered through caution. She entered adolescence, expecting to learn how to step into society. Instead, she learned how to manage sorrow with grace. Her youth was not stolen suddenly, but eroded gradually, like a shoreline losing ground to a relentless tide. There was no dramatic moment of loss, only the slow, steady realization that life would always exist on the other side of a window she could not open. By the time she reached her late teens, she no longer hoped for the things she once watched from afar. She had grown too accustomed to silence, too practiced at waiting, too familiar with the dull ache in her chest. Her adolescence was not defined by growth, but by the quiet acceptance of limits that tightened, year after year, like a frame shrinking around her world. When Maria Antonietta reached the years that should have blossomed into adulthood, her life instead settled into a kind of contemplative stillness, quiet, restrained, and narrowed by the unwavering demands of her fragile heart. While her sisters embroidered dowries, traveled between courts, and exchanged letters with potential suitors, she remained in a smaller world composed of soft lamplight, devotional pages, and the gentle rustle of turning paper. Books became her companions, not because she sought intellectual ambition, but because they offered what her body could not: the ability to travel without moving, to experience emotion without physical exertion, to belong to a world without stepping into it. Her days followed a rhythm that blended discipline with resignation. Each morning, After navigating the simple act of sitting up without dizziness, she was helped into a chair near the window, where sunlight filtered in through lace curtains. A maid placed a small stack of books beside her: prayer books, philosophy texts, collections of letters, and the occasional novel that her mother deemed suitable for a young lady of delicate nature. She opened them slowly, not out of lethargy, but because even reading required careful pacing. Too much excitement, a tense passage, an emotional chapter could accelerate her heartbeat in unpredictable ways. Yet she read with depth, lingering over sentences as though they anchored her to a reality she could not physically enter. The books she chose revealed a mind shaped by confinement, but not diminished by it. She gravitated toward contemplative works, drawn to authors who wrote gently about sorrow, duty, and the nature of suffering. She found solace in the introspective reflections of mystics and the calm reasoning of philosophers who acknowledged the fragility of human life. She preferred stories that unfolded slowly, as if matching the pace of her own existence. This quiet intellectual world gave her something that illness had taken: a sense of continuity, a way to build an inner self even as her outer life remained restricted. Her connection to religion deepened during these years as well, not in the dramatic form of visions or revelations, but in the quiet, persistent devotion of someone who found comfort in ritual. The family chapel was one of the few places where she felt safe. She often sat there in the early afternoon, when the sunlight slanted across the floor like a soft benediction, illuminating her pale hands folded in prayer. The journey from her chamber to the chapel was short, but even that required planning. A nurse supporting her elbow, pauses to catch her breath, a chair placed halfway along the route in case her heart faltered. Still, she made the effort, because the chapel represented a space where her limitations felt reflected rather than hidden. She prayed not for long life or restored health, but for calm, for acceptance, and for the strength to endure each day without burdening her family. Those who observed her at prayer described her expression as serene but tinged with melancholy, as if she were speaking not only to God but to her own fragile body, negotiating quietly with the limits it imposed. That serenity, however, was not the tranquility of someone at peace with her condition. It was the discipline of someone who knew that agitation would only worsen her symptoms. Her devotion was a form of self-preservation, a way of steadying her mind when her heart could not steady itself. Embroidery offered a different kind of refuge, one rooted in the tactile comfort of repetition. She often worked on delicate pieces, floral patterns, small religious motifs, and handkerchiefs embroidered with initials of relatives. Unlike her sisters, who approached needlework as part of their preparation for future households, Maria Antonietta embraced it as a form of meditation. The slow, rhythmic movement of needle through cloth calmed her breathing and gave her something to focus on during long stretches of afternoon silence. The results were exquisite, tiny, precise stitches, reflecting the discipline of someone whose body required stillness, but whose mind sought purpose. Yet, even in these moments of peaceful activity, her heart reminded her of its fragility. Sometimes her hands stilled abruptly, the thread slipping between her fingers as a wave of fatigue washed over her. At other times, she leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, waiting for the tightness in her chest to ease. These episodes interrupted her tasks without warning, turning the simplest activities into negotiations with her failing heart. Still, she always resumed her work, determined to maintain the small routines that brought her comfort. Her interactions with others became increasingly gentle, almost ethereal in quality. She listened more than she spoke, aware that conversation could strain her breath. Visitors often left her chamber with the impression that they had been in the presence of someone unusually kind, someone whose quietness was not emptiness but depth. Her politeness was never forced. It emerged from an instinctive desire not to add weight to the concerns of those who already worried for her. Even when she felt ill, she rarely complained. She saw the sorrow in her parents' faces and believed that silence was the least she could offer. Because she spent so much time observing rather than participating, she developed a keen sensitivity to the emotions of others. She noticed the subtle tremor in her mother's hands when doctors arrived, the heaviness in her father's footsteps after political letters arrived, the way servants softened their tone when speaking about her health. Her empathy deepened as her physical world shrank. With each loss of strength, her inner awareness grew sharper. This emotional intelligence became one of her quiet legacies, remembered only in passing by those who described her gentle presence long after her death. Yet, beneath the calm surface of her daily life, a subtle grief persisted. She did not allow it to dominate her expressions or conversations, but it lived inside her, a companion shadowing her every step. She understood, with increasing clarity, that she would never experience the milestones expected of a young woman of her rank. She would never enjoy the thrill of court life, never travel to grand cities, never marry, never raise children. Books and prayer filled her days not because they satisfied her deepest desires, but because they were the only realms accessible to her. Her quiet existence was not a choice, but a surrender one made with grace, but not without sorrow. She lived in a narrow corridor between illness and endurance, creating a small world of meaning within walls that had grown too familiar. In that world, she found a fragile peace, built from pages, prayers, and patient acceptance. But even that peace could not erase the truth. Her life was shrinking, slowly and irrevocably, as her heart continued its silent struggle against time. By the early 1882s, Maria Antonietta's life entered a phase where fragility became not merely a characteristic but a constant presence, silent, persistent, and undeniable. The signs had always been there, woven into every year of her existence, but now the decline was unmistakable. Her body, once merely delicate, began showing the unmistakable symptoms of a heart that could no longer sustain even the gentlest rhythms of daily life. It was as though the organ that had fought since birth had finally grown weary of its long, uneven battle. The first major change was her growing difficulty with breathing. She often sat with one hand lightly pressed to her chest, as if trying to steady the trembling core within. Conversations she once managed with quiet ease became punctuated by shallow breaths and long pauses. Walking even short distances across her own chamber, from her chair to the window, from the sitting room to the chapel, required careful planning and unwavering support. Her nurse, who had attended her since infancy, sensed the shift immediately. She walked closer, watched more intently, and spoke more softly, as though any sudden sound might disrupt the fragile balance keeping the young princess upright. Coughing became another unwelcome companion. At first, it appeared only during cold mornings, small and harmless, but weeks turned into months, and the cough deepened, echoing through her frail frame with a heaviness that alarmed her attendants. Sometimes, after a fit of coughing, she brought a handkerchief to her lips and found spots of red evidence of pulmonary congestion, a common consequence of advanced heart failure. She never panicked. Instead, she folded the stained cloth carefully, almost apologetically, as if embarrassed by the evidence of her own suffering. When her mother discovered the blood one morning, her face went pale with fear, though she tried to hide it behind gentle reassurances. Swelling in her legs and feet soon followed. Fluid accumulated quietly, adding weight to her already exhausted limbs. By evening, she sometimes could no longer stand without assistance. Her ankles, once slender, became tight and painful, forcing her to remain seated for most of the day. Her attendants placed cushions beneath her feet and wrapped warm cloth around her legs, hoping to give her some relief. But the swelling persisted, rising gradually like water in a narrowing vessel. Every movement became an effort, every breath a negotiation between will and weakness. Fainting spells, once occasional, grew more frequent and more prolonged. She might be reading, embroidering, or simply sitting in silence when her vision dimmed suddenly. The world receded into a quiet blur. Her pulse fluttered unpredictably, and she slipped into unconsciousness with an alarming stillness that terrified those around her. Sometimes she regained awareness within minutes. Other times, she remained unresponsive for longer, her breath faint and uneven. Each episode left her weaker and more resigned. Doctors visited regularly, though their presence offered little hope. Medicine in the 19th century had no cures for the slow suffocation of a failing heart. They prescribed rest, gentle nourishment, warm compresses, and minimal exertion recommendations that simply formalized the limitations she already lived under. Their grave expressions and careful words told her parents what they feared most. Maria Antonietta was approaching the end of her short journey. The decline might be slow, but it was irreversible. Her parents listened with trembling restraint, torn between the desire to protect her and the helplessness of knowing they were powerless against the inevitability unfolding before them. Yet what struck those around her most was her calm acceptance. She did not rage against her condition, nor did she cling to false hope. She seemed to understand her heart more intimately than any physician. Sometimes, during moments of quiet, she would place her hand gently over her chest and sit very still, as though listening to the faint ticking of a clock nearing its final turns. Her serenity did not come from denial, but from a lifetime spent recognizing her limits. In her final years, she spoke more softly and moved more slowly, but her gentleness deepened. She became even more attentive to those around her, thanking servants with a faint smile, holding her mother's hand during long evenings, offering quiet words of reassurance to her grieving family. Her empathy seemed to grow in proportion to her physical decline. She understood that her suffering did not belong to her alone. It radiated outward to those who loved her. And so she tried, in every small way, to make her impending departure less painful for them. Sometimes she confided to her journal that she felt suspended between life and departure, present yet drifting. She described days when her heart beat so unevenly that she wondered whether the next breath would come. But she never wrote with fear. Instead, her words carried a tone of weary familiarity, as if she had lived her entire life expecting such an ending. Her parents, especially her mother, clung desperately to hope. Adelgunde prayed constantly in the chapel, lighting candles whose soft flames mirrored the fragile flicker of her daughter's life. The Duke became increasingly withdrawn, spending his mornings in silent walks and his evenings seated by Maria Antonietta's bed, watching her breathe with the vigilant sorrow of a father who already knew what was coming. Despite the emotional heaviness surrounding her, Maria Antonietta approached each day with a quiet courage. She read when she could, prayed when her breath allowed it, and sat by the window whenever the weather was kind enough to offer her a glimpse of the outside world. She found a strange kind of peace in these moments, a peace made not of hope, but of acceptance. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of a weak heart. Now, in its final decline, she faced her fate not with resistance, but with a gentleness that seemed almost otherworldly. By the time she entered her 24th year, everything about her bore the unmistakable signature of a body nearing its end. The breathlessness, the swelling, the fainting, the quiet fatigue that seeped into even the smallest movements. Her life had been a long struggle against the inevitable. Now, as her heart began to surrender, she embraced a calm that those around her could neither understand nor bear. The young woman who had lived always between breath and silence was approaching her final stillness, one she had sensed and accepted long before anyone else dared to. By the spring of 1883, Maria Antonietta's body was no longer merely fragile, it was exhausted. Her heart, which had strained and fluttered since the moment she entered the world, began to falter with a frequency that left even her physicians powerless. Days blurred into one another, marked by long hours of rest, brief murmured prayers, and the soft, rhythmic crackle of the fire that was kept burning beside her bed to ease her chills. The quietness surrounding her was no longer just precaution. It had become the natural soundscape of her final weeks. Her family, sensing the gravity of her decline, gathered around her more often. Her mother sat with her in the mornings, reading softly from devotional texts or simply holding her hand in silence. Her father, though worn by years of political loss and personal grief, visited every evening, standing by the bed with the stillness of a man bracing himself against an inevitable blow. Even her siblings, scattered across Europe by marriages or political obligations, sent constant letters filled with gentle affection, hoping she could still read them without strain. But the truth was unavoidable. Every cough brought with it a faint trace of blood. Every movement triggered waves of dizziness. Every attempt at sitting upright left her breathless, her pulse racing, then slowing in erratic, dangerous rhythms. There were moments when her breath came so lightly that her nurse had to lean close just to be sure she was still alive. Even in these moments, Maria Antonietta never panicked. She had lived her entire life under the shadow of her failing heart. The approach of death, to her, felt less like an intrusion and more like the natural conclusion of a journey she had always known would be brief. In the final days of her life, she spoke very little. Words required breath, and breath required strength she no longer possessed. Yet when she did speak, her voice remained gentle, clear, and strangely composed. She thanked her attendants. She reassured her parents. She apologized for the worry she caused. The calmness of her spirit stood in stark contrast to the deepening fear etched into the faces of those around her. Even the most experienced physicians struggled to maintain composure. They recognized the signs: the slowed circulation, the persistent fatigue, the faint pulse that fluttered intermittently beneath her frail skin. She was slipping away. On April 12, the day before her final decline, she asked to be moved closer to the window. It took 3 attendants to lift her gently into a cushioned chair. She leaned her head against the frame and looked outside at the faint light of early spring. The world beyond the glass, with its new blossoms and pale skies, seemed immensely far from her reach. Yet she gazed at it with quiet wonder, as though observing it for the last time. She whispered that the air looked soft. Her mother pressed a kiss to her forehead, unable to speak through the tears gathering in her eyes. That night, her breathing became more labored. She drifted in and out of consciousness, waking only to murmur short prayers or grip her mother's hand with surprising strength. Her father remained by her bedside long past midnight, unwilling to leave even when urged to rest. He sat silently, watching the faint movement of her chest, each rise and fall slower than the last. The room felt suspended in a fragile stillness, every candle flame trembling, every breath held. In the early hours of April 13, her nurse noticed a subtle change. The tension in Maria Antonietta's shoulders eased. Her brow softened. The tightness in her breath loosened just slightly, as though she had found a momentary peace. She opened her eyes briefly, glanced at her mother, and gave the faintest smile, so small it might have been mistaken for an exhale. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she released a long, quiet breath, softer than a sigh, and then her chest fell still. Her passing was almost imperceptible. There was no struggle, no gasping, no desperate final attempt to hold on. She simply drifted away, like a candle flame shrinking into darkness. A witness, an attendant who had served her since childhood, later said, "Her little heart simply tired of fighting." It was an observation that carried both sorrow and truth. After 24 years of beating against its own frailty, the heart that had defined her entire existence had finally surrendered. When her mother realized what had happened, she collapsed beside the bed, clutching her daughter's hand as though warmth could be coaxed back into it. Her father stood motionless, his face drained of color, unable to reconcile the unbearable stillness before him. For a moment, the room became a sanctuary of grief. Silent, sacred, pierced only by the sound of stifled sobs. Outside, the world continued with indifferent calm. Dawn approached. Birds stirred. The first light crept across the horizon, but inside the chamber, time seemed to stop. Maria Antonietta died just 5 days before her 25th birthday. No court chronicler sang her praises. No political event marked her passing. No crowds gathered to mourn the princess who had never led armies, never attended royal balls, never played a role in the grand stage of European diplomacy. Her death was quiet, nearly private, known only to those who had lived alongside her gentle sorrow. And yet, to those who loved her, she left behind a profound absence, a silence deeper than the quiet she had lived in. Her life had been small in scale but immense in tenderness, defined not by accomplishments but by the grace with which she endured each breath. In her final moments, she did not resist fate. She welcomed the stillness that had hovered at the edge of her life since the day she was born. Her suffering ended softly. Her heart, at last, was at peace. Looking back on the brief, fragile life of Maria Antonietta of Austria-Este is like tracing the outline of a figure drawn in soft charcoal, delicate, faint at the edges, defined more by absence than presence. Hers was a life that never expanded beyond the narrow boundaries drawn around her at birth. Yet the quiet beauty of her character emerges through the subtle details preserved by those who knew her. When one attempts to summarize her existence, the temptation is to rely on dates and facts: 1858, Modena, disease, death at 24. But such blunt markers fail to capture the emotional truth of her journey. Her story was not a sequence of events. It was a slow unfolding of fragility, shaped by silence, resignation, and a heart that never possessed the strength demanded of it. She was born in 1858, the youngest child of Francesco V. d'Este and Adelgunde of Bavaria, in a palace already overshadowed by political instability. The world she entered was one in which duchies faltered, thrones trembled, and dynasties clung to remnants of influence. Yet none of these exterior dramas would mark her life as powerfully as the quiet defect hidden within her chest. From her earliest breaths, her heart beat too fast and too weak, as if struggling to keep pace with a life it had not been designed to sustain. Doctors recognized the signs, though medical language softened the verdict: a congenital weakness, a delicate constitution, a child in need of constant vigilance. That vigilance shaped her childhood. She grew up not in the freedom of palace gardens, but in the muted light of quiet rooms. Every movement required caution, every emotion required restraint. While other children ran, played, and explored the world with unburdened curiosity, Maria Antonietta learned to measure her steps, pace her breath, and preserve her limited strength. Her world shrank to a triangle of spaces: the bedroom where she rested, the sitting room where she read and embroidered, and the chapel where she absorbed her mother's whispered prayers. These rooms became the geography of her life, each one holding echoes of her soft laughter, faint sighs, and silent endurance. Exile arrived before she was old enough to understand loss. When her family fled Modena after the fall of the duchy, the child absorbed the sorrow of adults without comprehending its historical cause. She sensed her father's mourning, her mother's anxiety, the murmurs of servants carrying boxes down marble corridors. She grew up in borrowed residences, Austria, Bavaria, homes that offered shelter but no sense of belonging. Her own fragility was mirrored by the political fragility of her family. In many ways, she was a child born into displacement, shaped by a melancholic atmosphere she inherited without choosing. As she entered adolescence, the possibilities of life narrowed even further. Her symptoms intensified: chest pains, fainting spells, breathlessness, irregular heartbeats that sent waves of fear through her attendants. Her peers became young women preparing for adulthood, learning etiquette, attending dinners, being presented at court. Maria Antonietta watched from afar, her face calm, but her eyes holding the quiet recognition that these milestones would never belong to her. Marriage, the central expectation for a princess of her lineage, was never discussed. No prince was introduced. No diplomatic match was suggested. The political value of her birth could not outweigh the uncertainty of her health. She learned early that she was marked not by destiny, but by limitation. Yet within these constraints, her inner world deepened. Books became portals through which she visited distant lands and emotions she would never experience firsthand. Her faith, shaped by her mother's devotion, offered a language for suffering that made sense of her reality. She prayed not out of desperation, but out of acceptance, seeking peace, not rescue. Those around her described her as gentle, thoughtful, unfailingly kind. There was no bitterness in her manner, no sharpness in her words. She endured quietly, not because she lacked emotion, but because she understood that expressing pain only intensified the sorrow of those who loved her. In her final years, her condition deteriorated with an inevitability that weighed heavily on her family. Swollen limbs, blood-tinged coughing, blackouts that lasted minutes, and a fatigue so deep it seemed to seep into the bones of her being. Yet even as her body collapsed, her spirit remained unchanged. She greeted her attendants with gratitude, reassured her parents with faint smiles, and faced her decline with a calmness that defied the chaos unfolding within her failing heart. Her death on the 13th of April 1883, 5 days before her 25th birthday, was as quiet as her life had been. There were no final speeches, no dramatic gestures, no court chronicle emblazoned with grief. She simply exhaled softly, her heart finally releasing the struggle it had carried since birth. The chamber fell silent, but for those who witnessed it, the stillness felt sacred, as though the entire world had paused to honor a life defined not by grandeur, but by gentleness. To summarize Maria Antonietta's existence with dates and diagnoses would be an injustice. Her story is not the biography of a princess who shaped history, but of a young woman shaped by suffering, whose strength was measured not in achievements, but in endurance. She lived within narrow borders, yet her presence touched those around her with surprising depth. The fragility that constrained her was also the source of her profound empathy, her quiet wisdom, and the soft resilience that carried her through 2 decades of struggle. Her life may have been small in scale, but it reveals truths that resonate, that suffering need not be loud to be real, that gentleness, too, can be a form of courage, and that some hearts, no matter how weak, remain luminous in the memories of those who loved them. When one steps back to look at Maria Antonietta's life as a whole, the pattern becomes painfully clear. She was a young woman whose suffering did not arrive suddenly in adulthood, but shadowed her from the very moment she breathed her first breath. Her tragedy was not the result of a single event, nor a turning point, nor the collapse of fortune or political intrigue. It was woven into her existence from the first beat of her fragile, uneven heart. She entered the world already marked by limits, and those limits tightened around her with each passing year, constricting the possibilities of her life like an invisible thread that pulled tighter and tighter until there was nothing left to take. Her story is heartbreaking precisely because it lacked the dramatic arcs that often accompany royal tragedies. There was no betrayal, no scandal, no sweeping downfall that historians eagerly record. Instead, her suffering unfolded quietly, gently choking off the paths that most children, most young women, naturally assume they will walk. Every year of her life brought with it not new freedoms, but new confinements. As she grew older, the world did not expand, it shrank. The room she lived in became smaller. The faces she saw grew fewer. The dreams she allowed herself to imagine became softer, dimmer, and eventually disappeared altogether. Her heart, the small organ that controlled the rhythm of her days, behaved like a gatekeeper, blocking her from joy. It prevented her from running, from dancing, from laughing without restraint. It denied her the innocent recklessness of childhood, the spirited curiosity of adolescence, and the thrilling anticipation of adulthood. Her limitations were so deeply rooted that she could not rebel against them. Rebellion itself would have required strength she did not possess. And so she learned to live within the borders imposed by her own body, surrendering not out of choice but out of necessity. What makes her story so profoundly tragic is that she understood this better than anyone. While her parents tried to shield her from the full truth of her condition, Maria Antonietta was not naive. She felt the weakness in her limbs, the tightness in her lungs, the irregular flutter beneath her ribs. She knew her heart was not like the hearts of others. She saw her siblings prepare for futures she would never reach, marriages, court appearances, responsibilities, adventures. She watched them grow into roles she had once imagined for herself, only to realize that each year widened the gap between their world and hers. That awareness did not come in a single moment of revelation. It seeped into her consciousness gradually, like a fog settling into a valley. Even the love around her, deep, sincere, ever-present, could not save her from that reality. Her mother's prayers, her father's quiet sorrow, her siblings' affection, the attentiveness of her attendants. But none could change the fundamental truth that her life was being slowly constricted by the limitations of her failing heart. She lived in a world where protection itself became suffocation. The care that surrounded her kept her alive, but also reminded her constantly of how precarious that life was. And yet, what emerges most clearly from the fragments of her life is not bitterness, but gentleness. Maria Antonietta did not lash out at her condition or resent those who lived more freely. She carried her fragility with a kind of grace that seems almost unbearable to contemplate. Her acceptance was not born of resignation alone, but of a deep, intuitive understanding that her journey would always be short, always quiet, always overshadowed by the struggle within her own body. This self-awareness, combined with her quiet endurance, gave her a wisdom that belied her youth. Her dreams, those she dared to entertain, were simple. She longed to walk without fear of fainting, to breathe without counting the seconds between tightness and relief, to stand in a garden under the open sky without needing support. The desires she held close were not extravagant aspirations of royalty, but the basic experiences of life that others took for granted. In this sense, her tragedy feels almost universal. The longing for a life just beyond reach, for moments denied not by circumstance or misfortune, but by one's own fragile body. It is impossible to say what kind of woman she might have become had she been healthy. Her letters, journals, and the accounts of those who knew her reveal a mind inclined toward introspection, empathy, and quiet observation. She could have been a writer, a patron of the arts, a diplomat, or a mother whose gentleness shaped another generation. But such speculations remain in the realm of what might have been shadows of futures she never had the chance to consider. Her short life stands as the stark reminder that not all tragedies demand spectacle. Some are inscribed into the very bones and blood of a person, unfolding quietly in rooms filled with soft light, whispered prayers, and carefully measured breaths. Maria Antonietta's tragedy was not sensational, it was intimate. It was not loud, it was devastatingly silent. A life pressed inward by frailty, a destiny defined by limits beyond her control, a heart too delicate to carry her into the future she deserved. She was a princess by birth, but her story is one of the most human kinds of suffering, the sorrow of never being able to step fully into one's own life. In the end, what lingers from the life of Maria Antonietta is not the chronology of her illness or the political backdrop of her family's exile, but the quiet truth that some lives are shaped more by limitation than by possibility. Her story is a reminder that suffering does not need to be dramatic to be profound. Sometimes it appears in the form of a young woman who spends her entire life waiting for breath, waiting for strength, waiting for a moment when her fragile heart might allow her to step beyond the narrow path it carved for her. Her tragedy was subtle and deeply human. She did not face enemies, conspiracies, or courtly betrayals. Instead, she faced herself, her own body, her own breath, her own heartbeat that faltered without warning. It was a battle fought in silence, in dimly lit rooms, in whispered prayers and faint smiles meant to reassure those who feared losing her. Her courage lay not in grand gestures, but in the way she persevered day after day, knowing each breath was borrowed, and each moment demanded care. What she teaches us is that fragility can be its own kind of suffering, and endurance its own kind of bravery. She showed that a gentle life is not an empty one, and that dignity can be preserved even when the world shrinks to a handful of rooms and a few careful steps. The tenderness with which she met her fate reflects a depth of spirit often overlooked in grand histories. It is easy to honor the warriors, the rulers, the visionaries. Harder to recognize the quiet strength of someone who endured without recognition, without triumph, without a future to lean toward. Maria Antonietta's life invites us to consider the unseen struggles carried by those who appear most delicate. It reminds us that some people walk through their years with a weight no one else can feel, a weight that shapes their every movement. In her case, The weight was literal, a heart too weak to bear the demands of life. And yet she bore it with grace, with gentleness, with a kind of luminous patience that speaks to the resilience of the human soul. She died young, before she could fulfill any of the roles expected of her. Daughter of a duke, princess of an ancient house, potential bride of a European prince, but perhaps her worth is not diminished by the life she did not live. Perhaps it lies instead in the light she carried quietly, in the kindness she offered despite her suffering, in the small but meaningful traces she left on the hearts of those who knew her. Her story ends softly, just as her life did. No crowds gathered, no headlines announced her passing. She slipped away with the same gentleness that defined her days, a final exhale, a closing of eyes, a release from the burden she had carried since birth. But for anyone who looks closely, her life offers a lasting truth, that even the smallest, quietest existence holds dignity, that a heart, no matter how weak, can still radiate humanity, and that some stories deserve to be remembered precisely because they were nearly forgotten. Maria Antonietta lived briefly, breathed lightly, and left the world almost without a sound. Yet in her silence lies a lesson about compassion, about fragility, and about the delicate, fleeting nature of being alive.